Nietzsche said, without music, existence wouldn't be justified. Does a quantum of music justify history? Now, is history the same thing as existence? Somewhere Nietzsche says, all my researches are for the sake of justifying history, which makes him sound almost like a sort of a moralist. Um, so obviously Hegel had given a justification for all the misery um, the Shunazilas of time had suffered as the universal historical heroes, um, like Napoleon, according to the universal historical spirit on horseback, is what he claimed to see when he saw Napoleon ride through. I don't know if it was Jena. I think it was Jena, yeah, in his youth, um, where he wrote the famous First Logic. Um, whereas the dwarf spirit, the scientific spirit would only see this limited Zizekian, foul-smelling error in the stochastic system, or and the pipes that carry the feces and urine out of Rome, although maybe they don't move that fast unless it rains. Not sure exactly how they were able to deal with it. Quantum of knowledge from within all the random sufferings of history could only be justified, supposedly, if there were only one idea which told man what and who are told Dasein, man used in the general full sense, who the children of Israel are, or is sort of by that view vouchsafed by their understanding that they're the ones who can return. By Platon's view, we realize what this means by the interpretation of Sir Thomas More, who is a profound student of Platon, who nonetheless sort of still holds to not seeing the thing directly and perhaps not seeing it completely. Utopia. But what does this mean according to Heidegger? It means that the essencing of Athens, not of all, I'd read it before actually, but I forgot somehow. It hadn't stuck with me as a serious fact, but I knew that Aristotle had written like 100 constitutions or so, but according to Grok, there may have been 1,500 policies in around the time of Plato, Aristotle. There are also Thracian, not just pre-Hellenistic classical Greek policies. There are also many colonies in Anatolia, which is now Turkey, all over. Whether this also counted the Latini cities, I don't know, because very soon Rome took on a totally different model, which made Cicero already say, I don't know if we can still use analysis that has to do primarily with the small unit of polis for empire or imperium command. Yeah, so a quantum of knowledge out of this place where we realize there's different answers according to looking at it from the point of view of Abendland philosophy. Um, you could say in the Politeia, what we get is a picture that's not meant to be something to be brought about de facto. Aristotle does say, oh, maybe you could get the perfect historical, or as it were, um, by chance um, dispensation, and so that you'd have all the best actors to play the best roles, and then you could really create the philosophy king and the so-called utopian polis, or the guardians, as has been tried, I mean, more or less successfully with the Dalai Lama, who had control of armies in the past and so on. I mean, not the current Dalai Lama, but the Dalai Lamas in the past had armies under them and had been philosopher kings under that model. And so too with there's a dispute about who the Janissaries are, whether they're just sort of slaves become soldiers, or sort of whether they're an elite army. I think at different times they've had different roles, but basically the Ottoman Empire with the Janissaries was formed around this idea of having an elite guardian class who was chosen out of the countryside, like the Dalai Lamas are chosen to be leaders, and probably leaders who wouldn't have families, just as priests in the Catholic system didn't have families, so they wouldn't have competing interests with everyone else. But in this case, in the Ottoman Empire, it was public officials who wouldn't have families, so that they wouldn't have a competing interest. In the same way, obviously, Trump giving this huge contract for the futures in AI, which is the biggest direction of both of money in the Lombardian street unicorn searching sense, and money in the sense of the Modigliani price of his paintings keeps going up because people have to have some place to store their $560 trillion that's visible and untaxable. So it's sort of untaxable just for the reason that appreciation of property isn't really taxed. Maybe it's taxed at some low level, but it can't really be taxed at a big level, because you can't, it's sort of like you don't really know what it's worth. It's still in flux. It's a sort of form of like plasma capital or something, because it's, you know how you see these crazy things about the change in evaluation of Elon Musk's holdings have changed by, $30 billion all of a sudden. But it's just because it's an index of like how much people imaginatively think that there's potential in his companies, which is such a large field of change of move, flocks of this type of mega capital moving around. And where do they want to park their store of value that's 1,000-fold above the real economy in its magnitude? And so it's a big shifts, and it can derange everything very readily, because people take orders on the reliable promise of future money that's created through debt, or which is to say, the banks, when they say Elon Musk is worth that much, what they mean is this is how much we'll lend you. So that's how the wealthy live. It's by this kind of borrowing, and then saying we lost all the money we borrowed, and then we don't have to pay taxes. You can't do that with just income taxes. If you're making $500,000 a year or something, you have to pay a lot of taxes, and those guys pay like 40, like the top 1% in income pay like 40% of the taxes, if not more. But the people that control the trillionaires, as it were, don't pay taxes. But it's not that it's a conspiracy theory, it's visible, because their money's parked in these stores of value that don't really have. It's like if you own a house and then it triples in value or something, you don't have to pay that like an income tax. And then what they're doing is even more loophole-y, because they can borrow a lot against it and then call it all losses, like with the you remember the Epstein thing about the depreciated woman. That's because they can say their assets have fully depreciated because they need to be refurbished or something. People like to get a new kitchen every year or so or whatever, and then they say, oh, the other fixtures were totally depreciated. We could get nothing from them, right? Pure write-off. There's all kinds of tricks, but it only works for the people in the top and the trillionaire type of region. I know nobody's actually called a trillionaire directly, but they're playing in that general sort of ocean, that ocean with no shores, where they only encounter their own, except on like television shows or podcasts or something. But so that's the point, is when people mock and they say, ha ha ha, like Californians do, religion, God, the soul, ha ha ha. But they forget this has to do with whether out of this madness we can find some kind of stable ground in a way. And this is why Nietzsche is saying, yes, I have a nihilism, but this nihilism is meant, it's been thrust on us. We're not willing the situation where the misuse of all these funds in a certain way is, since 1982 especially, this sort of deranging Americans. But nonetheless, it's probably always like that on some dimension, sort of like a cheap, I know that's like a cheap wisdom, but it's like there's something Chinese. I think if we contrast our attitude with the Chinese, we always think, oh, that's a cheap wisdom. If you just say history is always like getting us. Okay, so that would be kind of in a way that's realism, but it's not, because realism self-fools itself by thinking I'm a realist, therefore I'm going to have higher predictive power, or I know more about reality. No, if you think about it that way, that's just a form of, that's a kind of just an idealism under another name. That's why Mersheimer sucks, because he's just kind of an idealist under a fake name, and he doesn't really know anything, because we only know, we don't even know, we never know anything. We don't know once it happened. We know in a certain sense this side won the war, maybe, or do we? I don't know. Strauss says maybe we don't, because the one often, it's not like Stephen Hawking says you lose the war and win the peace sometimes, as America is pretty good terms with Vietnamese, or at least part of Vietnam. But it's on another level. The way Strauss talks about it, sometimes the side, Prussia no longer exists. Germany no longer exists. It's become, the greatest representative of the old Germany is probably, like Merz, some guy like Merz, who's basically a Davos type of guy, a Ursula-friendly Davos type of guy. But he's sort of stern. You could see a little bit of sternness in him. But basically, the top universities, what they believed in was expressed through Weber, and through Simmel. Probably this is what Heidegger's talking about when he's talking in the Black Notebooks of Jewish thinking. The trouble with Jewish thinking. He's thinking especially of guys like Weber and Simmel, who created our current way of thinking in terms of the fact-value distinction, basically. The words were used before in a legal context: fact, act, building, making, factum. But they didn't have this same sense of facts as on the one side and subjectivity or normativity on the other side, until sort of Weber chopped up empiricism and gave it a sort of little sheen of moral respectability somehow. Put it sanitized. The way Strauss says it with respect to Simmel is he sanitized Nietzsche or nihilism. the failure and fall of Kant. But I mean, the long story short is that the thought of Prussia has taken over the supposed winners of the war, the Americans, and everyone else, and also I think Russians mostly. I mean, obviously not Dugin, and obviously there's big, great movement to restore some of the streams coming into Russia and the ancient fountainheads. But these still remain a little bit like streamlets, a little bit of not. The culture is very Soviet, I think. There's still a lot of Soviet attitude, which is basically very German and very, or better, very Prussian sort of attitude of the sort of time when Marx was coming in and then Feuerbach was coming in. It's Prussian in the sense of the fall of philosophy and the rise of Aufklärung understood as some kind of materialism, as some kind of the material factors are more important than the organizational and discussional factors. Man ist, was man ist. It's a pun, because the ist can mean eats, as well as is. Feuerbach, man is what he eats. But yeah, I think the Soviet period owes a lot to that time in the German thinking, so that both the Soviets and the Americans, though they won the war, they were taken over spiritually, as it were. That can happen. But yeah, I guess that's the interesting thing. It's sort of like it was taken over, but almost it launched, it hit generations, and it became normal or naturalized, before it could really be criticized, so that it's become normal. Like, so for instance, like you'll get this people like Neil Ferguson pointing to Weber as their savior, because they're saying, oh, look at Weber, he's the foundation, classical, telling us about Wissenschaft, and it's so much better than this postmodernism, which has come in through the literature departments to be our plague and baleful, etc., radical left, and so on. So you have I guess this is what I'd go back to again and again and say, you just have a more clear and better version, because they've considered more and more thoroughly and more seriously. When you look at people like Strauss and Heidegger, they're just they're perched better, as Nietzsche was. This is a tradition that knew you had to be perched a little bit, not just in your library, but you had to see everything, be receptive to everything. So, I mean, in other words, a philosopher is only occasionally, accidentally just a professor. But basically, a philosopher is something totally different, as we see with Heidegger, maybe with Gadamer to some extent, and with Strauss. But you don't see it in the rank and file, who nonetheless are necessary, because they keep the thing alive by teaching and creating more and more students who could, out of their ranks, you could get somebody who's good.